أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. This is our 16th episode in Intro to Rijal Studies. In the last episode we talked about Nawadir al-Hikma واستثناء ibn al-Walid, and that the book of Nawadir al-Hikma, which was a book of a humongous and enormous book of hadith authored by Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Yahya ibn al-Walid, the teacher of Sheikh al-Saduq, he excluded certain individuals and certain transmitters from this book. And so some said that Ibn al-Walid simply excluded certain transmitters because they were weak, because they were unreliable. So anyone whom Ibn al-Walid did not exclude must have been reliable and trustworthy. This was the mass authentication. This was the theory. We said that Sayyid al-Khoi rejected this theory, and he said that Ibn al-Walid, we don't know why he rejected some and accepted others, and maybe he accepted others, he accepted some of the transmitters of Rijal, Nawadir al-Hikma, not because it's been proven they are trustworthy, but because he relies on asalat al-adala, that any Shi'i by default is considered reliable and trustworthy by Ibn al-Walid and other former scholars. Now, to assess this theory, we say there's two opinions. One is that Ibn al-Walid, when he excluded certain transmitters, it's because they were weak. And those whom he didn't exclude, it's because they were reliable. This is one opinion. And the other opinion is that we really don't know why did he exclude some and not exclude others. Was it because those were known to be mughali, they were known for ghulu, or maybe they were known for their forgeries, or they were known for their fabrications? So just because he didn't exclude certain transmitters, it's not because they were reliable. No, because they hadn't fabricated, they hadn't forged, or they weren't known for ghulu. This is another opinion. What supports the first opinion, the mass authentication, the fact that he excluded some because they were weak and he didn't exclude others because they were not weak, we have certain clues to support this opinion. One is that indeed some whom he excluded were weak by the testimony of An-Najashi and Shaykh al-Tusi. Some of the individuals that Ibn al-Walid excluded, and Najashi specifically state that they were weak. Some of them were weak. And Shaykh al-Tusi also tells us that some of them were weak. So this is one clue. Another clue is that Najashi, if you remember in the past episode, Najashi told us regarding Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Yahya that he's reliable himself. This is the author of Nawadir al-Hikma. He was reliable himself, but as for his sources, he was careless. يروي عن الضعفاء. He narrated from weak transmitters, and he was careless as to whom he relied upon. So this is another clue that his book has lots of unreliable transmitters, and those were the ones that Ibn al-Walid rejected. This is another clue. A third clue, that Shaykh al-Tusi also rejects certain individuals because they're weak and they happen to be excluded from Rijal Nawadir al-Hikma. For example, people like Sahl ibn Ziyad, Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Sayyari, Muhammad ibn Isa ibn Ubaid. Shaykh al-Tusi considers them to be weak, and they happen to be excluded from Rijal Nawadir al-Hikma. So this is a third clue. Okay. Another clue is that An-Najashi told us that Ibn al-Walid excluded from Nawadir al-Hikma when Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Yahya says عن رجل I narrate from a man, and we don't know who that man is. He says, Ibn al-Walid excluded. He doesn't rely on that. Why? It's obvious, because we don't know who that man is. He could be reliable, he could be unreliable. So this is another clue why Ibn al-Walid would reject such sort of tradition when he narrates from عن رجل عن الصادق, for example. We don't know who that individual is. He's simply stating, I'm narrating from a man from Imam al-Sadiq. Well, who is that man? This is another clue that Ibn al-Walid, when he rejected this, he rejected it because we don't know if that man was reliable or unreliable. That means that those whom he didn't exclude were reliable. This is another clue. Another clue was what Ibn Nuh said, the student of Ibn al-Walid. He was astonished why Ibn al-Walid had excluded Al-Ubaydi, Muhammad ibn Isa ibn Ubayd. He says, I don't know why Ibn al-Walid excluded Al-Ubaydi from Rijal, Nawadir al-Hikma, although Al-Ubaydi was reliable. Why did he exclude them? This is the student of Ibn al-Walid. This tells us, this is another clue that Ibn al-Walid, he would reject, he would exclude based upon weakness. If he deemed a narrator to be weak, he would exclude him. Otherwise, he considers that person as reliable. Okay. These are clues that support the mass authentication of Nawadir al-Hikma. استثناء Ibn al-Walid لرجال Nawadir al-Hikma. The exceptions that Ibn al-Walid made to the transmitters of Nawadir al-Hikma. On the other hand, some say that Ibn al-Walid excluded certain transmitters not because they were weak, but rather because they were known to be mughali. They were known for their ghulu. For example, like Sahl ibn Ziyad. Sahl ibn Ziyad was known to be mughali, and that is why Ibn al-Walid excludes him. So not because he was weak. Another argument that could be made against this mass authentication is that we don't really know why Ibn al-Walid excluded these individuals. And what Ibn Nuh said, Ibn Nuh, this was his assessment of Ibn al-Walid's exceptions. Ibn Nuh was performing ijtihad. He was telling us that my assessment of Ibn al-Walid rejecting Al-Ubaydi was incorrect because Al-Ubaydi was someone reliable. In other words, this is Ibn Nuh's assessment. It's his personal analysis. And we can't really rely on his personal analysis. In my humble opinion, I think that we can rely on this mass authentication. We can rely on the clues that we just mentioned, that Ibn al-Walid does indeed exclude certain narrators because they were weak, because he deemed them to be weak and unreliable. So we can actually rely on this mass authentication. We'll move on to another mass authentication and the final mass authentication in our discussions before we move on to another chapter, and that is the chapter of Amarat al-Wathaqa, indicators of reliability. The final mass authentication is called Tawthiq al-Shaykh al-Mufid fi Risala al-Adadiya. Al-Shaykh al-Mufid has an article, not too big, called Risala al-Adadiya. And this is regarding a specific fiqhi discussion regarding the start of the month of Ramadan. The discussion is as follows: that the month of Ramadan, does it always end with 30 days, or can it be 29 days, or sometimes 30 days? I'm sorry, I said the start of the month of Ramadan. No, the end of the month of Ramadan. the end of Ramadan? Is it always 30 days, or can it be 29, and it could be 30 depending on moon sighting? Hence, it's called Risala al-Adadiya, the Risala regarding numbers, the numbers of the days of Ramadan. Is it always 30? So when we begin fasting, we have to finish 30, or it depends on moon sighting. It depends. If the moon is sighted a night earlier, the days of Ramadan will be 29. And if it's not sighted, the days of Ramadan will be 30, depending on moon sighting. So Shaykh al-Mufid, he chooses the latter. He says that it all depends on moon sighting. If the moon is sighted early, it could be 29 days. And if it's not sighted, it will be 30 days. He chooses this opinion. And he does not choose the opinion that Ramadan is always 30 days. Why? He says because the narrations of al-Ru'ya are a lot more than the narrations of al-Adad. Because there are contradictory narrations. There are some narrations that say Ramadan is always by numbers, 30. We go with the numbers. We go with the number of 30. On the other hand, there are narrations that say no. We go with moon sighting, with al-Ru'ya. Shaykh al-Mufid, he says that I choose the other. I choose the narrations of al-Ru'ya. Why? Because they are more. The narrations of al-Ru'ya are more. And those who narrate the narrations of al-Ru'ya, of moon sighting, they are the following. Al-A'lam, al-Ru'asa, al-Ma'khud anhum al-Halal wal-Haram. He mentions the names of the companions of the Imams, who are about 42 individuals. And he says, these companions of the Imams, they are reliable. They are trustworthy. They were jurists. They were not just transmitters. They were jurists whom we could rely upon. And hence, this is where the mass authentication is taken from. What Shaykh al-Mufid says regarding these transmitters. He praises them a sort of praise that is befitting of maraja', of grand jurists, right? And so he says, Al-A'lam وأما رواة الحديث بأن شهر رمضان شهر من شهور السنة يكون 29 يوما ويكون 30 يوما فهم فقهاء أصحاب أبي جعفر بن محمد بن علي وأبي عبد الله جعفر بن محمد. And he says, as for the narrators of the month of Ramadan being a normal month, it could be 29 days and it could be 30 days, because there are other narrations that say Ramadan is an exception. Ramadan is always 30 days. He says, no, we have other narrations that Ramadan could be 29 and it could be 30. The transmitters of these ahadith, وَأَمَّا رُوَاةِ الْحَدِيث فَهُمْ الْأَعْلَامِ. They were known individuals. الرؤساء, leaders. الْمَأْخُوذ عَنْهُمُ الْحَلَالِ وَالْحَرَامِ. These are individuals that we take what is halal and haram from them. وَالْفُتْيَا وَالْأَحْكَامِ. We take fatwas and laws from them. الَّذِينَ لَا يُطْعَنُ عَلَيْهِمْ. These are individuals that you cannot say anything bad about them. وَلَا طَرِيقَ إِلَى ذَمِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمْ. There's no way that you can say there's something negative about them. وَهُمْ أَصْحَابِ الْأُصُولِ الْمُدَوَّنَةِ. And they are the authors of the usul. The usul which consist of the narrations of the Imams, the early usul, the first books of hadith that were written by the companions of our Imams. Now, this is obviously a mass authentication. He's authenticating all of the narrators of these ahadith. And we said there are 42 individuals. Those who narrate the ahadith of al-Ru'ya, that the moon has to be sighted, and Ramadan could be 29 days and it could be 30 days, and it is not always 30 days. The narrators of these narrations, there are 42. Shaykh al-Mufid just gave a mass authentication. He authenticated all of them. And it's not just a mass authentication, to be honest. It's a lot more than that. He's not just simply saying that they are reliable and they're trustworthy. No, he's saying that they're scholars, they're jurists, You could perform taqleed of them. You could emulate them. So it's very clear that this is a mass authentication. In fact, this is one of the clearest mass authentications. And these are only 42 individuals. It's not like when a Shaykh al-Mufid, when he said regarding the companions of Imam Sadiq, all 4,000 of them, they were reliable. No, these are only 42 individuals. So it's not far-fetched that a Shaykh al-Mufid can authenticate 42 individuals. However, some individuals have a problem with this theory. Namely, As-Sayyid Taqi al-Qummi. He says that we cannot rely on this testimony by Shaykh al-Mufid. Why? Because Shaykh al-Mufid is saying, الذين لا يطعن عليهم ولا طريق إلى ذم واحد منهم. He says, these are individuals where you cannot put down any of them. There's no path to saying anything negative about them. Sayyid Taqi al-Qummi says, this doesn't mean that they were reliable. It's just saying there's no path to saying that they're negative or saying that they're untrustworthy or unreliable. This doesn't mean that they were reliable. If someone else can come and say that these individuals were unreliable, then khalas, we can knock them out and say that they are unreliable. So just because لا طريق إلى ذم واحد منهم, this is what he says, من الظاهر أن مجرد عدم الطريق إلى الطعن لا يستلزم إثبات الوثاقة. Just because there's no way of proving that they were unreliable. This doesn't mean they were reliable. Sayyid Taqi al-Qummi, he says, what I understand from a Shaykh al-Mufid, of course he doesn't say this is what I understand. He's saying this is what al-Mufid is saying. Just because there's no way of proving that they were unreliable, it doesn't mean that we've proved they're reliable. And then he says that what al-Mufid is saying, basically, that you could take halal and haram from them, you could take your ahkam and fatwa, that means they were mujtahids. And how can al-Mufid prove that they were mujtahids and say we could emulate them? This is what As-Sayyid Taqi al-Qummi stated. May Allah bless his soul, rahmatullah alayh. However, we can reject what Sayyid Taqi al-Qummi stated by saying al-Mufid, when he said there's no way of proving they were unreliable, he's not saying we don't know, are they reliable or unreliable, and we can't really prove that they were unreliable. No, this is not what al-Mufid is saying. Al-Mufid is saying we can't prove that they're unreliable. لا طريق إلى الطعن. لا يطعن عليهم ولا طريق إلى ذم واحد. There's no way of proving that these individuals were unreliable. Meaning there's no proof. There's no proof. Meaning these individuals were so righteous, they were so reliable that there's no one that can come and say they're unreliable. This is what al-Mufid is trying to say. He's not saying that there's no way we can prove they're unreliable, but this doesn't mean that they're reliable. No, he's trying to say that these people were so good, they were so righteous, they were so reliable and trustworthy that there's no one that can come out and say that they're unreliable. This is one. Two, what's the problem of saying these scholars were mujtahids and we can take fatwas and ahkam from them and laws from them? Why? What's the problem? Yes, they were not mujtahids like we have today because ijtihad has become very complex. We can't expect to compare them to, for example, Sayyid al-Khoi, who was the king of ijtihad of our time. We can't compare them to people like Sayyid al-Khoi. However, ijtihad evolved. Ijtihad during the days of the Imams, it was simple. It wasn't complex. For ijtihad, all you had to know was, you had to know the narrations of the Imams, what was general, what was specific, and that's it. It didn't require much more than that. Ijtihad later evolved. So why can't we say that they were mujtahids according to the ijtihad of that time? So there's nothing conflicting in what Shaykh al-Mufid says. He's saying these were scholars, they were jurists, that you could take halal and haram from them. They were reliable. Why can't we rely on this? And hence, Sayyid Taqi al-Qummi, after a couple of sentences, he comes back and he says, وَلَكِنَّ الْأَنصَافَ أَنَّ مَا أَفَادُهُ الْمُفِيدُ دَلِيلٌ عَلَى كَوْنِ الرَّجُلِ ثِقَةً. And he's speaking about Ziyad ibn al-Mundhir, Abu al-Jarud. Abu al-Jarud is one of the 42 individuals mentioned in Risala al-Adadiya, those who mentioned the narrations of al-Ru'ya, that Ramadan could be 29 days or 30 days. He's saying, indeed, what al-Mufid says is enough to testify that Abu al-Jarud was someone reliable, just because of what he mentioned in the introduction, meaning that he accepts. But what's astonishing is that after a couple of sentences, he goes back rejecting the mass authentication. Then he says, وَلِقَالٍ أَنْ يَقُولَ أَنَّ مُجَرَّدْ عَدَمَ الطَّعْنِ لَا أَثَرَ لَهُ. Just because there's no one saying they were unreliable, it has no effect. It has no meaning. Just because no one said they were unreliable doesn't mean that they were reliable. He goes back, which is very strange of Sayyid Taqi al-Qummi to go back and forth, first saying this is not a mass authentication, doesn't mean anything, and then he accepts it, and then he goes back to rejecting it. Anyhow, Al-Wahid al-Bahbahani accepts this mass authentication, and so does As-Sayyid al-Khoi. As-Sayyid al-Khoi, whom rejects many mass authentications, he accepts this mass authentication. And he says that what Al-Mufid did in Risala al-Adadiya, what he says, العلماء الرؤساء الذين يؤخذ عنهم الحلال والحرام والفتيا والأحكام الذين لا طريق إلى الطعن عليهم, and so on and so forth. He says this is a mass authentication for those 42 narrators and individuals. And we see this in his fiqh, and we see this in his Rijal, specifically regarding Abu al-Jarud. One of those 42 men is Abu al-Jarud. Abu al-Jarud is a controversial figure. Some have accepted him, some have rejected him. Those who accept him as a reliable transmitter, and I am among those who accept him as a reliable transmitter, it's based on Risala al-Adadiya. It's based on Al-Mufid's mass authentication and Risala al-Adadiya. Sayyid al-Khoi, in his fiqh, he accepts Abu al-Jarud, and he says, because Al-Mufid authenticated him. And his Rijal, again, he says, we accept him because Shaykh al-Mufid authenticated him in his Risala al-Adadiya. And among other Rijali scholars who accepted this mass authentication was Sayyid Ali Sadr, a contemporary scholar in Qom, and Shaykh Abdul Hadi al-Fadli, a contemporary scholar from Saudi Arabia, who passed away a couple of years ago. May Allah bless his soul. But amongst those who reject this mass authentication is Sayyid al-Sistani, hafidhahullah, and his son, Sayyid Muhammad Rida al-Sistani, our teacher. They both reject this mass authentication in Risala al-Adadiya by Shaykh al-Mufid. And they say that it's meaningless, and we cannot accept this claim. We cannot authenticate those 42 individuals that have been mentioned in Risala al-Adadiya simply because of what al-Mufid stated. Why? Well, what's the problem? He says, Sayyid Muhammad Rida al-Sistani, our teacher, in Abasatun min Ilm al-Rijal, he says there's two problems. One is that these titles, this lavish praise by al-Mufid, al-Ulama, al-Rusa, al-A'lam, al-Ru'asa, الذين يؤخذ عنهم الحلال والحرام والفتيا والأحكام, this praise is not befitting of all of these 42 individuals. Some of these individuals, they were righteous, they were good, but they were a'lam, ru'asa? No. Some of them were, but some of them weren't. So this praise, it is not befitting of all of these 42 narrators. Maybe it is befitting of half of them, but half of them, do not deserve this praise of being scholars, being huge scholars who you can take their fatwas and emulate them. So this is one problem. Another problem is that some of them were weak. A minority of them, of the 42, were weak. They were unreliable. Maybe he mentions 2 or 3. Said Muhammad Rida, Hafidhahullah, he mentions 2 or 3. And he says some of them were not even Shi'i or Imamis. Some of them were Waqifis. Some of them were Fatahis. Some of them were Jarudis. They were not Imamis even. So how can we accept this mass authentication? How can we call them al-a'lam, al-ru'asa, and all of that, when some of them were not even Imamis? They accepted other schools of thought. Some of them were weak, and some of them were not even scholars. Hence, we cannot accept this mass authentication. Mass authentication. We can say in return, and as I've mentioned in my book, that just because some of them are not scholars, it doesn't mean that we cannot accept them to be reliable. You see, what we want from a Shaykh al-Mufid is to prove that they're reliable, not to prove that they were top scholars or maraja. No. And what a Shaykh al-Mufid says, in reality, he's saying that they are all reliable. So they're not all scholars, so be it. That's not a problem. Just because they're not all scholars, a'lam ru'asa, that's not a problem. But are they all, most of them are reliable? Yes. And Sayyidina al-Ustad, Sayyid Muhammad Rida, he testifies to this. He says, although most of them were reliable, but not all of them were scholars. If you agree on this point, why can't we accept this mass authentication? Al-Mufid, indirectly, although he's telling us that they are a'lam, ru'asa, we can take fatwas and ahkam, and these people, you can't even tell us that they're what is he trying to tell us? They're trying to tell us that they're reliable. And to this, we can accept. Some of them were not imamis, so what? There were Zaydis, or there were Waqifis, or there were Fatahis, so what? It doesn't mean that we cannot accept. It doesn't mean that they are not ulama, and they are not ru'asa, they were not leaders. They were leaders of the time. They were the scholars of the time. And so we reach the conclusion that we can actually rely upon this mass authentication in Risala al-Adadiya by Shaykh al-Mufid. And with this, we conclude our chapter on mass authentications, al-Tawthiqat al-Amma. In the next episode, inshallah, we will talk about amarat al-Wathaqa, indicators of reliability. How can we tell if a person is reliable or unreliable? There are ways of knowing. We will see, and we will discuss this, the indicators of reliability, which will take several episodes in themselves. We will discuss this in the next episode, inshaAllah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.